L'Afrique s'est dotée depuis 2005 d'un programme d'action relatif aux questions de la criminalité et de la sécurité, dont le blanchiment d'argent, qui porte atteinte au développement. Les actions menées depuis lors et les stratégies à adopter face au blanchiment d'argent ont été examinées lors du dernier séminaire de la Banque africaine d'import-export sur le financement du commerce en Afrique. Tagbo Agbazue, le directeur exécutif du Centre panafricain d'études politiques, a participé à ces travaux. Il est notre invité pour cette édition de Décryptage. L'un des éléments clés sur lequel vous vous penchez le plus en ce moment est le blanchiment d'argent. Comment expliquer ce phénomène? Quelles sont ses manifestations et ses phases?
Money laundering essentially is how criminals, traffickers, smugglers, your organized crime syndicates, how they try to disguise the proceeds of their crime and isolate it from the sources of those crimes. So essentially money laundering are efforts that are targeted towards disguising the proceeds of crime, moving those resources and utilizing those resources. Now, remember that the purpose of crimes that are committed is in order to generate those funds or those proceeds. So if you prevent people from using the proceeds of monies that are illicitly gained, then you're discouraging the commission of those crimes. Now, the phases, money laundering has different phases, three main phases. The placement, the layering, and the integration phases. Now, during your placement phase, the illicit funds are introduced into the financial system in one way or the other. Then during the layering phase, the purpose of the criminals is to move, to shift, and to mingle and commingle illicit funds with funds from legitimate commercial transactions. So it might involve a whole range of transactions, loans out, loans in, moving the money across jurisdictions, across different banks. Remember, the purpose of the layering phase is to disguise where that money came from and to mingle it with funds from legitimate commercial activities. Then during the integration phase, those illicit funds have now been cleaned through the first two phases and are now being utilized, whether for legitimate investment purposes or to buy different luxury goods, etc.
Vous avez pris part du 3 au 6 octobre 2022 au séminaire sur le commerce et la finance d'Afreximbank et les questions de commerce et de financement étaient le fond de ces travaux. Parlez-nous-en.
There's been a lot of development across the world in terms of advancements in fighting cash-based money laundering. So remember, your criminals, the very sharp, witty, the good business people, despite whatever level of education that they have, they're constantly adapting. So trade-based money laundering has become more popular since the global financial system has become more hostile to cash-based money laundering. So a lot of criminals are now trying to exploit trade as an opportunity to launder the proceeds of their crime. So essentially, trade-based money laundering means trying to move or shift value, which is money, resources, using trade as a conduit for making that happen.
Quels sont les moyens, stratégies et politiques mises en place pour lutter contre le blanchiment d'argent, notamment dans le domaine du commerce et de la finance en Afrique?
There's two aspects that I think it's important to understand. One is, what are the challenges that are faced by banks, custom authorities, and law enforcement in terms of fighting trade-based money laundering? So that's one aspect. The second aspect is, what can banks do to be able to deal with this? So let's unpack the two. Firstly, why is it difficult for stakeholders, for law enforcement, custom officials, and banks to deal with issues around trade-based money laundering? The global trade volume for 2021 alone is about $29 trillion. So there's a lot going on. It means that every week There's millions of goods and containers that are moving from country to country across the world. And criminals use that large trade volume to disguise certain activities for the purposes of transferring value from one jurisdiction to the other. Now, remember that banks are involved in trade finance. They don't physically inspect those goods and those containers. Thirdly, it's only the importer and the exporter that have the full picture of the trading activity. And then there's a large paper-based set of documentation that can be manipulated. And like we said, the banks don't deal with the physical goods. So a whole lot of this have, made it more difficult for banks to be able to detect these suspicious transactions.
Votre institution a-t-elle fait une évaluation de la perte causée par le blanchiment d'argent?
The cost of money laundering in Africa is huge, especially when you talk about illicit financial flows. Research indicates that Africa is hemorrhaging about 50 to about $90 billion annually through illicit financial flows, which means that funds that should be available for Africa's long-term development and sustainability will losing these funds through a global financial structure that involves secrecy jurisdictions, tax havens, shell companies and the like. And I think Africa in this regard needs to strengthen its public tax and fiscal transparency systems and structures, but at the same time, we need to engage with stakeholders in the developed worlds for their companies to behave when they're in Africa and to get a firm commitment from them in terms of supporting Africa's growth and development by removing the structures that create that vulnerability for Africa in terms of illicit financial flows.
En parlant de la ZLECAf, entrée en vigueur depuis janvier 2021, nous supposons qu'il s'agit d'une activité commerciale et de flux financiers très importants. Vous investissez-vous à aider le secrétariat de la ZLECAf à réfléchir aux politiques à mettre en place pour lutter contre ce fléau?
The African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement makes Africa, creates huge opportunities for Africa in terms of regional integration, but also in terms of intra-African trade. Now, the Pan-African Center for Policy Studies is very much involved in research and engaging in terms of policy around how are we going to implement this? How can the envisaged free movement of goods, services, and people across Africa also benefit women, especially women involved in intra-African trade? So the thing is that there has to be more information, that is disseminated across the continent. Ordinary people, entrepreneurs, including women, need to understand the opportunities created by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and how it can work really for African people. Yeah, so at the center, we're involved in a whole range of research, policy engagement, but also training. There are a lot of institutions that require training. Even the frontline officers like a police, your custom departments, your institutions your trade and investment promotion institutions within the respective African countries also need to enhance their processes to ensure that ordinary Africans and African entrepreneurs can be able to take advantage of the opportunities provided by the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement.
Monsieur Tagbo Agbazue, merci d'avoir répondu aux questions d'Africa 24.